I've always loved films. I mean, I didn't actually start going to the cinema as a child because I lived in a small village and there was no cinema nearby. I started going to the cinema in earnest when I was a teenager, and that was the time of films like The Devils, Midnight Cowboy, Straw Dogs, The Wild Bunch. I mean, it was, for me, the golden era of cinema. Grown-up cinema, cinema for adults. Almost all of the films were X or 18 rated. Annoyingly, it changed from X to 18 just at the point when I got old enough to go to X's. Anyway, so I always wanted, to do it. I studied English literature at University of Sussex, but I finished helping with the University Film Society. Kim Newman was also there at the time, so I met him. And I saw an awful lot of films during that time in Brighton at various cinemas. And when it came to the end of my course, I decided to do a 2-year postgraduate diploma in film studies, which was the only thing I could find at the time that was being run by something called the Polytechnic of Central London that no longer exists. And I did 2 years of that, and coincidentally, as I finished that, the very first MA in film studies in this country, taught MA, opened up at the University of East Anglia. So I was one of the first 5 guinea pigs who went on to that course and did that 1-year taught MA. I finished that. I was in Norwich because the University of East Anglia is in Norwich, and there was a small magazine called Cover which wanted to be the Time Out of Norwich. Listings of everything, theatre, cinema, whatever. I put myself forward to be their film critic, and a guy called Steve Kaplan and his partner Carol Homden gave me a job, and that was it. First film review I ever wrote was Southern Comfort by Walter Hill. I mean, everything about the industry has completely changed. We're going back a long way. I mean, 30 years was a long time ago. And when I got started, basically, if you were... Let's give you an example. I moved to London having worked on Cover magazine in Norwich for a couple of years, and I basically starved for about 3 years. But I managed to get a couple of reviews in the monthly film bulletin. Kim Newman was very helpful in getting me an introduction to Richard Coombs, who was then the editor of the monthly film bulletin. And that was a respectable British Film Institute publication, which meant if they trusted you to do stuff in there, then you had a degree of credibility. I then started writing reviews for NME, who used to run quite a copious kind of film section then. And slowly, I made the connections. I met the PRs from the different film companies, in-house and outside. And I, together with, various people who helped me a lot at that time, I managed to kind of piece together a career. At that time, I was also syndicating interviews that I did in London to a variety of What's On magazines around the country, which were all very much clones of Time Out. So there was one in Manchester called City Life, there was one called The List in Edinburgh, there was one called Event Southwest, which was based down in Cornwall, and there were various magazines like that. And I made a fairly comfortable living. Over the years, a lot of those magazines have gone broke because once the internet came along, obviously it became increasingly hard for any magazine that had as its unique selling point listings to survive, because those listings were now available free on the internet. And that made, purely in terms of finance, the analogy of course is with local newspapers. Local newspapers, when I first started in journalism when I left school at 18, made all of their money out of small ads. All of those small ads are now online. Most of those newspapers struggle to make ends meet now. More crucially than that, there's been a complete sea change in the culture surrounding film, I think. And I think what happened was that in the old days there was a sense in which there was a kind of a compact, a gentleman's agreement between the PR companies surrounding the big film distributors and the journalists, that there was a thing which was called film culture. And it was worth writing seriously about movies in a way that was more than 5 stars for this and 4 stars for this and how many quotes can we get on the poster. All of those things still existed, but there was very much a sense that everyone was agreed that film was something that was worth taking seriously. When magazines like Empire came along and they established themselves as having a completely different brief, which was basically to become an arm of the PR industry and to sell their soul to them in order to get exclusive access on set, for example, very much up front, and to talk about films in a way which was really more like advertorial than like actual criticism, which of course gained them a lot of readers because, as we know, readers increasingly want to know what a film is like before the person has even written the screenplay on which the film is going to be based. So that was a very good move on their part. What it meant was that it emptied out the element of criticism and film culture, which had been part of the industry up to that point. I regard star ratings as an evil, as an unnecessary evil. I think that the degradation of film criticism more or less began at the point where star ratings became standard across the board in serious, so-called broadsheet newspapers, as well as in fan-type magazines like Empire and Total Film and stuff like that. I think that that kind of reductive criticism where people will simply look at the star rating and if it's, say, 2, they won't even bother to read the review. I find that fundamentally flawed as a way of talking about film. There were other stages along the way. At one time, no film in Time Out was less than 270 words. It didn't matter if the film was Police Academy 5 or Platoon or The Abyss or, Avatar. All films would be given 270 words, which meant if you were writing the review, as I probably did, of a Police Academy 4 or something like that, you had to find something to say about where it fitted into the series of Police Academy films, what kind of humour they were saying now, how things had changed since the beginning. And it was an exercise in placing that film in some kind of context. And context is everything. Star ratings are about nothing. A critic who knows the star rating of everything and the value of nothing, to me, is not a film critic. They're a reviewer. And so my problem is that, in a sense, yes, there is an evaluative element to all film criticism, I think. It's always subjective. For example, there's a horror film which is around and about still at the moment, It Follows. I do not understand the enthusiasm that people have for that film. Many people whose opinions I respect, many people whose writings I read, like Kim Newman in Nightmare Movies, had a huge influence on my thinking about horror films, tell me that there are good things in that film. I personally can't see them. I have watched it twice and I do not understand, so I have to understand that in this particular instance, I appear to be out of step. However, I still think that my opinion has some value because I have seen 1 or 2 horror films over the years, and my argument isn't simply, I don't like this film. Oh, there's that thing, and how come the monster is always changing its appearance, and how come it can be any kind of a monster? How come there's no consistency to the way that it appears? And that's informed by my having seen 30 years worth of horror movies from across the historical spectrum and across the global spectrum of horror movies by going to film festivals and seeing, films from different countries and so on, different traditions. So I suppose what I'm trying to say in essence is, if I want to read a review of a film, I would sooner read a review of a film by somebody like Kim Newman or Mark Kermode, who I know has invested the time and the interest and the intellectual discipline in understanding the historical global context of what horror is and where it is at this moment in time, than to read a review written by somebody who is 19 years old, perhaps already a very good writer, but doesn't have that body of knowledge behind them. I find that their opinion is possibly of less value than the opinion of somebody who is informed by that body of knowledge. The fact is that now it is easier than ever for anyone to get published. Any young person with an interest in film and a rudimentary knowledge of how the internet works can set up a blog and start writing about movies. They aren't even necessarily going to press screenings, advanced screenings. They might just go to the multiplex the first Friday that, say, I don't know, whatever film it is, opens, and then they can sit down and they can publish online their thoughts about the film. People say that democratizes the business of film criticism, and you can't really argue with that, because it's all very easy to say, well, they haven't served their time. You know, they haven't spent 2 years on the monthly film bulletin reviewing every single Police Academy film from 1 to 5 and trying to say something intelligent about them, you know. On the other hand, their opinion is their opinion. It may not have the backing of a great deal of film history. It may not have any understanding of film theory. They may not have read Men, Women and Chainsaws. So I may not take their opinions about horror movies all that seriously. That doesn't mean to say that it's a bad thing that they're around and that they're multiplying. On the other hand, and this is the nub of it for me, there is no kind of filter now. There's no quality filter. So anyone with any grasp, rudimentary grasp of English grammar, and a lot of it is quite rudimentary, can get online and start writing reviews that don't have a beginning and a middle and an end, or make a lot of sense, or have any kind of understanding of film history or the film industry. That's another thing. You know, people very often write about superhero movies as if they somehow grow on trees. They don't really have a great, necessarily an understanding of where they came from, the comic books they're based on. I don't, because I'm not personally interested in them. Show me a film with somebody with magical powers, my brain shuts down. I have no interest in it. My opinions of superhero movies are, frankly, pretty much valueless. But are the opinions of people who are just what we might call disparagingly fanboys or fangirls any more or less valuable? I would say less. You know, there are a lot better writers than me out there, and many of them are a third of my age, you know. But the fact is that there are certain reviews that I read, and I think, for instance, I often read reviews where people say, here is a review of the remake of Red Dragon. I haven't seen Michael Mann's Manhunter, but here's my review of Red Dragon. That review is of no value to me at all. Your job as a film critic is to have seen that film, is to know that this is a remake, this is based on the same Thomas Harris book, and this is a remake of a film that was made earlier, and you need to tessellate those three things. You need to have read the book, you need to have probably read other books by Thomas Harris to understand why that is better than all of the others put together. You also have to understand who Michael Mann is. You have to understand at what point he was in his career when he made that film. And you have to compare those two films and place them in some kind of context of the way that the film industry works in order to give me any sense that you have a right to review that film in the first place. I mean, you know, as a Howard Hawks fan, professionalism is everything to me. You know, professionalism in Howard Hawks is everything that all of his films are about, and professionalism in this business is everything that I am all about. And I think it's true that if you feel that your work has value, if you feel that you are being paid to do a job, and people are prepared to pay you to write intelligently about film, that gives a value to what you're doing. It gives you a sense of reality. When Time Out first phoned me and said, we have been reading your work, and I know you sent in some examples a few months ago, would you write a review of Platoon for us? That validated me as a film critic. It meant to me that they had read other things that I read, and they trusted me to write a review which would have some value, which would not embarrass the magazine. Because the magazine has a tradition and it has a value, and when that review appeared in that magazine, it was one of the great stepping stones in a career of being a film critic. Now, if somebody, ironically, may have all the time in the world, because they may still be living at home with their mum, and they might still be writing their reviews, living and typing, into their computer, in their bedroom, in their parents' house. They may have all the time in the world. What they don't have is the validation from somebody else who has published them, who is publishing a magazine which in itself has a history and a value and has some sense of dimension to it, which a blog, which you set up yesterday, doesn't necessarily have. There will increasingly be more and more outlets for the kind of film criticism that you would like to write and that people of your generation would like to write. And those places will be available to you as of right. You would just be able to set up a blog, set up a YouTube channel, make your own little documentaries, this, that, and the other. The difference is you will never be paid. People will tell you over and over again, and sometimes they will believe it. When the website starts to make money, we will pay you for the reviews. That's our plan. Our plan is once we raise enough advertising revenue, we will pay you to write reviews for the site. And in the meantime, you should work for nothing. These people are unpaid interns. All of them are unpaid interns. Their enthusiasm and their knowledge is being exploited by people who genuinely believe, in many cases, that they will one day find the holy grail that will allow their websites to make money and be in a position to pay their contributors to write about film. It is never going to happen. If there are so many websites ever expanding, nobody will ever generate enough advertising in order to pay people. So a whole generation of people who grew up aspiring to do what we do, who aspire to do that now, will never have a profession of being a film critic. There are a lot of people out there with a lot of talent, young people who write well, who have an understanding of film, who can make little visual essays, something I could never do, for example. I mean, my craft is writing, my craft is words. And so when I see a little visual essay put together by somebody about the making of Jaws or something like that, and they've put this together in their own time, maybe a 60-minute documentary about the making of Jaws, for which they're not being paid anything at all, I take my hat off to those people and I say, go ahead, do that. But, unless that YouTube channel that they've set up in order to post that online actually starts to generate some revenue, they will not get paid. And I don't know where these sites, these professional sites, where people get paid, are going to be generated from. I don't understand what the business model is that would allow that to happen. If a newspaper like The Guardian is still losing money hand over fist when it has invested the amount of time and finance into its online presence as it has, then how is it possible for a startup company to create something that is so unique and attracts so much in the way of readers or viewers, whatever they are when they're looking at a website, that it can actually generate advertising revenue sufficient to pay everybody who is required to run the site in the first place and then contribute to it? Because the strength of any website will be however many freelance contributors there are, because a magazine, a publication is only ever as good as its freelancers, because the freelancers bring a specialist knowledge to that, to the game, and there, as a sum total, the sum of those parts is so much greater than the magazine would be if it were all written by one person or two people, however brilliant they were. So if you have somebody writing for a magazine like Time Out, like Tony Raines, who knows pretty much everything there is to know about, what we might call Far Eastern cinema, or whatever the category is, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, whatever, then I value his opinion, and his opinion is of some value. But will that same person coming through now find an outlet which will pay them money? I very much doubt it. Doesn't matter about being best, doesn't matter about being good. As long as you're first with the story, then that's the value now. Peter Jackson said to me once when I interviewed him about Lord of the Rings, he said, Nigel, the trouble, now is people want to see the film before you've written a fucking screenplay.